So I'm quite excited because the past sessions yesterday it was quite interesting, and I'm wondering like what else do I have to say? And I think this, if you hear what I say online on social media, this may be the last place that I would probably show up and give a talk to a group of publishers, considering what I'm about to talk about. So the title is a bit provocative, but bear with me. And I think there's a lot of things here that you can probably take away. And eventually I envision an ecosystem which different kinds of actors can participate. So the slides are online. There's some projects linked here. So if you go to the slideshow, you can find all the links there. So there's I will talk around Solid project, the Link Research Initiative, and a little bit of maybe the dokieli application that I'm working on. But those are not the core components. It's what I hope that you take away from this is perhaps the core principles of the ideas that are discussed here, and what kind of a system or ecosystem that we want to have going forward in context of research communication. So the article is actually my thesis online. So a lot of the things that I've discussed is basically the core of my thesis. Yeah, so let's get to it. So yeah, that's my web ID, the thing that identifies me on the web. I control that, and I basically specify exactly how I want to describe myself to the world, and as well as which other identities that I want it to link to. Not sure where. So there's a slide that's missing. Okay. Okay, we'll go with this one. Is it? No. Okay, no idea. So if you can see, okay, I was just about to say that the core of my talk will be around autonomy and universal access. And so I will not directly answer describe these, but I will talk around them, and you can probably see where I'm getting at by the descriptions. So self-publishing is, I'll just quote this, because I probably can't repeat that as precisely as I can. So self-publishing entails that an actor can register identifiers for their content, shape, and stored data where they have access to, set access control policies, and use preferred applications to achieve them. And this is in context of course, or application of using open web standards. And majority of this talk will be around the two aspects, like I said, autonomy and universal access, and I'll focus mostly on identifiers and how we can shape our data, or how actors can shape their data. So maybe before we dive into that, I'll just briefly mention the purpose of the web, and it's really that it's a social design, and when Tim Berners-Lee proposed the information system that we know of the web, it was to have a social effect, so that people can communicate better and exchange their ideas. It's to have a positive net effect there. And what we put, or the principles that we associate, or what we want out of the web, is it comes back to society, right? So what we expect from the web, and this is not just unique to the web in general, but I think the same principles applies to the scholarly communication. So what we put on the web, or what we expect from the web, how we communicate on the web, it affects basically the society. We change our laws and how we communicate going forward. And then it's a cycle. So it's a social machine, and I think we can learn a lot from it, or by observing the core principles of the web, and how we can maybe reuse them in the scholarly communication. So the interesting thing about the web is that anyone can say anything they want. that's good news, right? And, but the bad news is that anyone can say anything they want. So we need to work with that. That has to do with these web standards or the standards that we have to whether they're ethical principles, based on ethical principles or grounded on ethical ideas, to basically how we assign what's valuable or how we can establish trust and so forth. So for instance, just because I say something on the web doesn't mean that it's true, right? And there's a social system around it to help us figure out whether it has any substance. So I don't mean to offend anyone, but I'll just go, this is probably as technical as it would get. There are 3 core design components to the web, and everything pretty much that we do on the web is coming out of these parts. And the W3C proposed this, it has a recommendation on architecture of the World Wide Web, and it describes these 3 areas. I think it's probably one of the most important documents out there. And if you are interested in the space of identifiers or coming up with different ways of expressing documents, this is probably the document that you want to read. As well as when you're building writing specifications, new specifications. So one of them is identification. So how do we identify things on the web? And that's primarily through the URIs, and the other is interaction. How we can get a request some description of a thing that's on the web, and the data format is basically how that thing in there is described or self-described. So the URI could be like an it can be any type of URI with any scheme, HTTP to FTP, mail to, these are all different URIs. And when you come up with a new URI, you don't need to change the other components on the web. So when we come up with a new data format, let's say PDF, and never existed before, we don't need to redesign. We don't need to come up with a new interaction mechanism or a URI just to work with PDFs or just HTML or RDF or any number of these formats. And so changing one of them does not affect the other. And that's a good thing because they evolve independently. So as I said, I will focus on identifiers and data shapes mostly in this talk. And there's 2 principles, there's about 5 that Tim proposed in '96, and I'll focus on them. So basically, one of the axioms is that any resource of significance should be given a URI. So if you think that that document the hypotheses in that document should be something that exists on the web, then we give it a URI. It has a value. When you put something on the web, it has a value. If it doesn't have a URI, then it doesn't exist, at least from the perspective of the web, because machines can't get to it and humans can't really navigate to it using their tools. And the second, another identity, so there's other axioms, but I'm only focused on these 2. And the other is the significance of identity for a given URI is determined by the person who owns the URI, who first determined what it points to. What that means is basically if I have a URI, like this one here, my web ID, I get to decide what that thing is, right? As I mentioned, I describe my own profile. I link into other things on the web. I say this is something that I've created. Here are my photos or where I store my other things that I've created on the web. Or my email, and anything that I want to describe about me, pointing to my CV, for example. So, so these are at the lower level, right? And we build everything from here on. So all of this is just social. They're based on social agreements. So when we have DOIs or ORCIDs and so on, it's based on these more or less these axioms. And so the interesting thing is that with something like a DOI, it's yet another social agreement on top of the URI system. So if we agree that the URI mechanism, which is based on there's a hierarchical system based on the domain name system. So csarven.ca is, for example, a domain name which I have to rent. I pay an annual fee, and there's a social agreement that okay, I control it or own it, and there's no particular reason. I mean, there are many reasons why that may be taken away from me. So the Canadian government can, because it's under their authority, the top-level domain.ca, they can they can say that okay, you're no longer going to have this domain for whatever reason. But we have that agreement, so implicitly or explicitly, depending on where you're looking at it. So it's so. Regardless of the systems that we use, there's always some form of a social agreement that we work with. And if the web is if we look at the web, whether we like the DNS system or not, it has worked fairly well, I would say. And I think most people would agree with that. There's, of course, a lot of issues with it itself, because it's yet another system. But it works. So 3 decades on, and it has transformed the world, right? So on top of that, like for example, again, the system like a DOI system or an ORCID system is yet another. It's a social wrapper on top of that. So if you trust that system, that's fine. And there's some agreements on who controls the DOI, the ORCIDs, which organizations, which entities. And what are the constraints around that, of course. So I'll just transition into like what generally when we mean centralized and decentralized architectures, and most of the web, or most of the bigger. So the web itself is a decentralized system, but we have a lot of centralized systems, big pockets of centralization happening. So if you're using essentially any third-party system, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, any social media, to anything on publishing and scholarly communication, they're usually fit somewhere in this centralized architecture. Of course, there's a range of things. So some aspects of the system may be centralized, some may be decentralized. But I'm just making general classifications here. So the centralized system would usually require like a user agent, your web browser, for instance, and interacts with the website. And the website says this is what the interface is and the data for underlying data. So if you want to, read it or sign into it, those things are coupled, right? What we're trying to do in the Solid project is to decouple these components in a way that you can use different interfaces, different agents to act on the data. And so you can use different applications at any point on the same data without having to change the data, right? So just to make comparisons to existing systems, if I want to access my profile on some social media third-party system, the user interface is coupled with the data, and I'm in a way limited to the number of devices or interfaces that I can use with that data. However, if we decouple it and using web standards, we can in fact leave the data alone. It can be self-describing, and for example, in a linked data form, and we can use different interfaces to basically understand what the document means and what we can do with it. What are the affordances? So if you take anything away from this talk, you should take this away, because I think it generally describes what we're trying to get at. And I'm happy to discuss this, of course. So I think that there are 3 areas of control, and there has to do with identifiers, data, and applications. So what that means is that, again, like the URI system, who controls the URIs, who's assigning them, who's registering them, who's perhaps looking after them. Will they be around in 5 years or 5,000 years? And the data, what's the shape of the data, what can be said in that data, if it's human and or machine readable, what granularity of that data, whether different aspects of the data is identifiable, right? So example, most of the scholarly communication is happening around, or scholarly publishing, I should say, in a document-centric way. So you have a document that has your manuscript, and it's human readable, of course, but most of that is not machine readable. Or at least you need to do some reverse engineering, or you need to unless predefined or pre-configured ways of understanding what that data is, then you can understand it. So right now, you're able to understand me, I hope, because we agree on this language, right? Or the terms that I use. You're aware of what they are, so we're able to communicate. For machines, this is difficult unless you tell them, oh, here's a vocabulary and what that term means, and then they will understand. Otherwise, it's just a blob of text, which is why, well, I'll get into things like HTML and RDF and so on shortly, but it's how you describe the data, what the shape is, basically lets you articulate the components that are machine readable as well. And the application is the other aspect where you have how these applications can interact with us through the identifiers, make sense of the data, show something useful for the user. So it's a spectrum, I think. There's actors on one end, like individuals, let's say, and the third parties. Basically, if actor is the content creator, then you have the third party, which is not the content creator, but maybe the one that's possibly making it available. So I think most of the scholarly publishing right now is happening on this, on the right end. The third parties, in a way, control the identifiers, the data, and application. So examples: ORCID, DOI are identifier systems, and they are determined by some organization or entity that is not the individual, right? So again, example with this one, my web ID is on the left end because I pick that and I say what happens under that space. However, a DOI or ORCID is basically determined by what's happening under that space by those entities. And of course, the applications that can make use of that is basically whatever is allowed to be described under those URIs. So if those that control the identifiers and those that determine what the data should be, basically dictates in a way, what applications can also use that, right? So I would raise the question of, in scholarly publishing, what should be identifiable, what can be significant, what is the smallest unit of communication? Is it just a document that we want to be able to point at, or can we refer to any arbitrary part in that document? Is it discoverable, right? Can machines discover it, or findable? Can we query it? And who says what should be identifiable? What's significant, right? Again, the axiom, right? We have the axiom here. Any resource of significance should be given a URI. And who says what's significant? How accessible is it? Is it only for some humans? When you have some document behind a paywall or requires some special authentication or authorization requirements, policies, can they get to it? So if I can't get to some document, if it doesn't have a URI, or even if it has a URI, but if I cannot walk to an internet cafe and fetch that URI and get a description, does it exist? If it's not publicly, universally accessible, then the question is, the question may be that, is it scientific? If it's only a subset of humans can only access it, right? So if I said 2 + 2 = 5, and I said, here's a proof, and you need to give me $1 million to see my proof, and you can't get to it, is it meaningful? Like, do we need to talk about that? And I'm exaggerating an example, but that's exactly what's happening. So if the majority of humans can't get to it, why are we bothering with it? But that's just humans. What about the machines, right? And like I said, a machine may be able to get to it, but is it actually going to make sense of it? And the other challenges I find is around archiving. Is it publicly archivable? And I've done some quick experiments where I try to use the Internet Archive to try to archive some open access document out there. And it's quite common that the publishers, certain publishers, I won't name any of them, would block the crawlers. And the question is like, why? It's open access, and why would you block an archive, a public archive? And to elaborate on what the data may be like what can be described in that document, right? Can I point at and describe the evaluation section of my document, the results, the workflows that led to the results, and so on. In any aspect, introduction, any arbitrary part, an argument, a thought, is that machine readable, right? And can it be linked with other things on the web? And whether those things are using based on open web standards. And that's what makes it interoperable. So we agree on the standards, and then these things can be, we can have different implementations adhering to those standards, and they can be done independently, and to the most degree, or at least the way the standards are done, are so that they're interoperable. But if we, and on the other side, if we independently develop our own systems, and then look at them and try to say, hey, how come I cannot exchange, data? Like, why can't I use my own application to understand your data, or vice versa? And then we try to build these bridges, or post-facto interop, which is sort of specialized way of trying to make sense of these systems. That's sort of the on the other end, and it doesn't scale. So simple example is that I cannot just use the Facebook interface to make sense of Twitter's data, right? Just says I cannot probably use any of the publishers' interfaces to make sense of the other publishers' data. So the common issues that I find there's a class of issues, of course, but around user experience, and one of them is privacy. And most of the, even if it's open access published documents out on the web, they require JavaScript or cookies. So that means that if the user doesn't have JavaScript enabled, for instance, in some cases you cannot actually fetch the document and get the complete document, the content. You need to have JavaScript to do this dynamic fetching. But what happens along with that, because of this requirement and it's third-party publishing, there's user tracking happening, profiling of users, networks and data brokers behind that, of course. And this is a bit scary and creepy. And there's a bunch of research around that. I won't get into it, but you should click through these and find some interesting results. But so it's not just the third-party publishers, but it happens on government websites. It's all over the social media. We're tracked all the time. And you have different identities, and they're interlinked, different machines, different devices, and so on. So we need to go against that, I think. Or use systems which would not violate our privacy. The other constraints around that are imposed with the third-party systems is that they're actively blocked, like I said, with the archiving, or how often can you access that same article on that website, whether your IP is tracked, so after 10 views, is it blocked, and so on, and depending on where you're trying to access it. And again, the proprietary data models and access methods around that, so almost every system is, on the user-facing end at least, they're all coming out with their own data models, their own vocabularies, their own, whether it's HTML or PDF, it doesn't matter. they're describing it based on whatever works in their system. That's, of course, different than how the data may be exchanged behind the scenes, which may adhere to some standards, or at least some standards, not necessarily open standards, but some standards. So these documents include ads, subscription forms, they're branded with a publisher. So this, you're looking at a manuscript on a web page, and it's filled with all sorts of stuff. So it's not just the article that you're looking at, but there's different elements in there which, to a machine, it's nonsensical. It's just, random stuff, and there's no clear way of distinguishing what's what. So if I were to have an application that wants to extract certain components from that document, it's quite difficult. At least it's difficult. Of course, we can write some specialized scripts to glean the information from one document, but try doing that with across all the documents published by different entities, right? So the same application is not capable of understanding all these different documents, so it doesn't skip. And the persistent identifiers are actually, the DOIs are usually lending to web pages, right? They're not necessarily lending to the documents that, not strictly at least, lending to the actual document. You need to maybe hop over, you need to sign in perhaps. So, little shift. Those were maybe complaints or challenges that we have. And I will just start with a quote from one of the specifications that I co-edited at W3C, and I'll just read it. Data on the web should not be locked into particular systems or be only readable by the applications which created it. Users should be free to switch between applications and share data between them. So we wrote this actually while we were working on the Solid project, so it has that sort of a view there, and I think in some ways it describes the Solid project or the vision as well. So we want to decouple the identifiers from the data and applications and so on. So what would that mean, right? If we do this sort of decoupling, and there's just an example. So some common types of documents like profiles, articles, annotations, notifications. So we have articles, any kind of an article, scholarly article to a blog post to whatever. And we have annotations that are referring to these documents. And they're stored in different locations, different identifiers, and different entities, of course, control them. So the key thing here is, of course, who imposes where the article should be or where the annotation should be. I'll give examples of, like, you're aware of certain annotation tools which would basically give you the option of either annotating the web, but using their extension, and the annotation would be stored on their server. So regardless of the licensing and all that, it's the entity, the domain name that's rented by the system would dictate basically what happens in that system. And it's at their discretion whether they want to change it or not, or remove it. Or you may be able to use the same sort of a tooling on a system where the tool, the client-facing tool that lets you annotate, can only talk to that specific server, right? I cannot just use the same application on any part of the web to annotate things and store it where I want. So what this system is trying, or this sort of system is trying to do is that if I want to annotate the web, I should be able to store my annotation where I want or where I have access to. And we don't need to sacrifice anything here. It's just that it's all based on web standards. It's not hypothetical. I've worked on a tooling which the dokieli tooling lets you do this. You specify basically, you come in, you try to come in and play with. So by the way, these slides are actually I don't have access to this. I can't really sign in right now, but it looks something like this, basically. So this is a dokieli document. You don't really see it, but it's there. It's human and machine readable. So here I would have, I sign in with my web ID, And all of these components in this document are machine readable, and so on. I won't get too much into that, but just that maybe if we have the annotation. So here's an annotation on the abstract. So this article is at this URI, and this annotation is, if you can see at the bottom, it's stored under a web space that's completely different. And that's determined through my profile. So my profile says that I want to store my annotations at this other location on the web, which is different than my web ID. So my web ID is at A, where I want to store my annotations at B. This article is at C, right? And different entities can control their own contributions. Okay, so I'll try to be quick because, so anyway, just a quick here. This is my thesis, and all these components in this document are, because it's machine readable, I can throw in some silly visualizations which says what's what. So I can say, here's one idea or one significant thing in this document is linked with another significant thing on the web. So a citation, right? I can say this idea, not just this document, but this idea has a particular or kind of a relationship with another unit out there on the web. So I can say this argument disagrees with that, right? So we're not just saying currently what we have is, let's say, DOI cites DOI. What this is saying is that this thing has a specific relationship to that other thing on the web. So it's quite different. Right, so I have to speed up, I think. But we're almost done. So there are, you may be already aware of this, there's core functions, forces and functions, and they're decoupled in a sense. So the systems that we design can map to this really easily. Registration, how we identify things. Awareness is how we can disseminate. Certification is, of course, quality control and so on. And archiving is another external function which can store our content. And different types of actors, different ways of content that we have, what the access rules are, and applicability. This is another external force which basically says, what we need from scholarly communication. So, yeah. So I'll try to skip these things, maybe wrap up you can look at these things. So some of these projects which helps you to see to what extent can we use these systems. So you have something like Open Research Cloud, which says, well, okay, scholars can distribute their things on the web in a machine readable way, and all they have to do is basically send a notification to a system that just says where it is or what happened, what that activity was. And we don't tell people to, where they should be storing their articles or annotations. And this can be discovered using web standards. So the social linked data to solid project is a general, is for the web. It's not specific to scholarly communication, but we can apply the work that we're doing right now in Solid to scholarly communication because I believe it addresses a lot of the issues that we have right now on who publishes, where, and how. And I encourage you to check it out or join our team. So I will maybe challenge you with this. So right now, what I can do on the web is that I can register a domain name, let's say around $10 a year, and have some shared hosting. I mean, this is just a basic setup, right? $100 a year. It could be a couple hundred, doesn't matter. It lets me register or create any arbitrary number of identifiers, individually controlled, so I can tell who can access which of the documents, right? It's universally accessible in the sense that it's human and machine accessible, interoperable, it's publicly archivable, using, of course, different standards so that different applications can use the same data. There's social interactions, and I think it's privacy respecting. So I can do this today, and my colleagues can do it as well. And in the Solid project, we're trying to make this easier so that more people can do this without having to go through third parties. So don't get me wrong, it's not that third parties are always evil or anything like that. The underlying goal is that different actors can participate on equal grounds, right? So I'll just leave you with this final slide. So notice that I haven't talked about open access or fair or anything that would perhaps entail what we're talking about here. I didn't talk about Plan S or anything like that. So given what's possible, what are the constraints? Like, what are we working with? When we say open access, like, what are we saying that it's open access if the publisher is a company of some sort? I don't know, so I hope someone can tell me whether Plan S would let me self-publish and still participate on equal grounds. If I can't, why not? Again, these are different functions. Just because I have something on my website, my thesis or my article, my scientific research, on my website, it doesn't mean that it's quality controlled or peer reviewed and the community agrees with it. All it means is that it just exists. It's just, there's an identifier for it, it's machine readable. Certification is a different function which tells you, which can be accomplished or met by different parties. So my peers can review my article and publish their own reviews in their own web spaces or community spaces referring to my article, right? So what are the constraints and how inclusive? So can we talk about open, quote unquote, without, by excluding the possibility that I use my own web ID or I publish my own document in a way that I think that it's most accessible or reusable? How inclusive is it? So there are trade-offs, and I think that, so if the system that we're designing, if the scholarly system says that you may only participate if you have an ORCID or it has to have a DOI, is that actually an inclusive system? Because remember I said that these are social wrappers or on top of what's already possible. It does not actually add anything more than what I can do on my website. I can provide you with same type of persistence if you trust me, right? On my website as any other, given that the publishers' third-party systems do change their quote-unquote persistent documents. So who controls our online identities and data, and what they look like, and how granular and how descriptive they can be? What are the real costs to participate? So, there's social pressure, of course. If you don't have if you don't publish at a certain journal, or if you don't have a DOI, or if you don't have an ORCID, then who are you, right? Do you exist? Are you making a contribution? That's what we're saying, or at least that's what the expectation is right now. So I'm challenging that. And whether the mechanisms and artifacts that we devise are ethically grounded. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We started a bit late with the coffee and things, but I think we've still got time for just one or two quick questions, and then I'll ask if Sarven, if you're happy to join the panel, and then we can, because I think it interacts with what we're going to be talking about shortly. So have we got any immediate quick questions? Can we?
I think, look at this one. Oh. Yeah. I'd like to hear from
Martin Hicks, Barstein Institute. When one's comparing the decentralized web with the centralized sort of versions, one of the arguments in favor of centralization is looking in terms of, in particular, data quality, validation, certification, and the people who are supporting the centralized system say it's easier to do in the big silos, and you can curate things and index things more easily. What's your opinion?
The ease of use, I suppose. I guess with that comes with what are you giving up? What's the trade-off? It may be easier, but I'm giving up on my autonomy, right? Or how I want to express my document. Right now, the requirement is that I just give a LaTeX or PDF document to, because it's easy, that the third party publishes, I'm giving up on all these other things, which what the web actually enables me to do. So, I think we should weigh them more. Yes, there are pluses and minuses, but we should weigh them, I think. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And the Solid project is trying to bring that barrier down so that more people can participate easier. So we don't all, run into third parties to publish. We can indeed publish, self-publish. That's what the web allowed us to do anyway. So there's nothing particularly new here. It's just that the social system that we have is requiring us to go through these systems. It's not that I can't self-publish, or anyone.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I think what you're arguing or challenging is that we don't actually need social infrastructure like ORCID necessarily and other identifiers. And yet I think most individuals, myself included, would not be able to self-publish and provide the sort of rich architecture that you are doing for your own thesis. And isn't this more about enabling a social infrastructure that is governed more by the community, for example, as ORCID is doing, and as Cameron's pointed out, it's the principles of governance around that architecture which allows more people to be visible and to be part of that sort of connected, interlinked objects, and that it's not all or nothing, and that you need to help people, but it's how that's controlled or how it's governed and sustained.
Right. That's a good point. It's about choice. It's not that people should stop using ORCIDs or DOIs. It's that if we're talking about an inclusive, if it's a genuinely inclusive system, then it should allow me to participate using my own identifiers. If you choose to use ORCID or any other system that has certain benefits and there's an agreement around, or some promise that it will be around for a while, and there's sort of a commons thing, so that's fine. But if for instance, if I were to have an ID associated with my publication that, let's say through a publisher, and if they say that you can only identify yourself using an ORCID, I don't consider that to be an inclusive system. It's either, basically the system says either ORCID or nothing. Or if you don't have a DOI, you don't have it's not a publication. So there's an expectation around this, yes, why we use these systems, but again, the persistence, these are different layers that can be still promised. It's a social system still in the end. I don't know if that helps.
It is, but in a way, sort of the pragmatic thing is, yes, you can, we need some common identifier to get this thing going, and those types of metadata to be openly available. So yes, you can have what else you want, but actually having a common standard.
I'm going to have to sort of step in here and be Mr. Nasty, I'm afraid. But
I would just say that, does that, I think that's not the accurate way of, necessarily the accurate way of looking at it. It doesn't have to be, the common identifier doesn't have to be under orcid.org. With the identifier is that it's just some ID there that has perhaps a description that's useful or lets me authenticate through different systems. So maybe you're thinking of the common identifier as like which entity controls it, and I'm saying that, well, that's fine, but that's the common. There are different identities on the web, so, and I think and the possibility to interlink with these different identities. So anyway, we're happy to discuss this longer. It's a fascinating topic, I think.
So once again, thank you very much indeed.